Hey there, sixth graders. Today we're going to be exploring how to multiply integers and why the sign becomes what it becomes. So we're going to go through a few examples and really analyze, why, and here's a spoiler alert, why a positive times a negative remains a negative, and why a negative times a negative becomes a positive. So we'll start with some pretty simple examples and then expand from there. So remember, multiplication is really repeated addition. And we learned how to add integers. So now that we're multiplying integers, we can use our knowledge of adding them to be able to solve these. So for instance, if I have 3 times 4, well, that means I have 3 sets of 4. Or if we flip those around using the commutative property, it means that I have 4 sets of 3. So either way, I can solve using repeated addition and I get 12. So let's take a look now at what 3 times 4, negative 4 would mean. Well, that would mean I'd have 3 sets of negative 4. So this would be equivalent to negative 4 plus negative 4 plus negative 4. Now remember, when we're adding integers, we think about our song for our shortcut. Same signs add and keep, different signs subtract. Keep the sign of the higher number, then you'll be exact. So if I take a look here, I have negatives plus more negatives. Same signs I add and I keep, so that's negative 8. Negative 8 plus 4 more negatives, well, that gives me a total of 12 negatives. So as you can see, this first example, I had a positive times a negative. My answer remained negative. Let's do a couple more examples. 4 times negative 2, well, that means I have 4 sets of negative 2, so this is going to be negative 2 plus negative 2 plus negative 2, plus negative 2, negative 2, negative 4, negative 6, negative 8. This next example means I have 5 sets of negative 3, so this will be negative 3 plus negative 3. That's negative 3 plus negative 3 is negative 6, plus negative 3 is negative 9, negative 12, negative 15. And the last example here, negative 6 times 4. Well, I can use my commutative property. I can switch those, and that is the same thing as 4 times negative 6, which is 4 sets of negative 6. And this gives me 24 negatives. Okay, now many of you are realizing a shortcut already, so let's go ahead and summarize what we're noticing. So are we noticing a pattern? What happens when you multiply a negative integer by a positive integer? Yeah, all we're doing is you multiply normally. Your answer will remain, your answer will be negative. Because what you're doing is you're taking multiple sets of negative numbers and you're combining them, and that's going to remain negative. So we can kind of conclude here that if I have a positive number times a negative number, it remains negative. And I can flip those around. If I had a negative times a positive, that still will remain negative. Okay, let's start analyzing why what happens with a negative times a negative. And we're going to use our knowledge of opposites. Now remember, what are opposites? Well, things like positive 5 and negative 5. Positive 100, negative 100. And we're going to use our knowledge of the distributive property to see what type of answer we get. So I'm going to start with a problem that you probably wouldn't have thought of on your own, and that's okay. We're going to go ahead and multiply negative 5 by 2 plus negative 2. Okay, so we are going to be multiplying 5 by 2 plus negative 2. Now notice, these are in parentheses, okay? So I have 2 ways I can tackle this. I can use the distributive property, which we'll do next, or we can use our order of operations, and our order of operations are parentheses, exponents, multiplying and dividing, adding and subtracting. I do have parentheses, so I'm going to do that first. 2 plus negative 2, those cancel out. So this is really 5 times 0, or excuse me, negative 5 times 0. My answer better be 0. My answer better be 0. I'm repeating that because this is really important. And our answer needs to be 0 because now we're going to tackle this using the distributive property. And that will be our hint. Well, that'll show us why a negative times a negative becomes a positive. So let's use the distributive property now. And we're going to distribute that negative 5 into both of those numbers. So this is negative 5 times positive 2 plus negative 5 times negative 2. We just concluded above that a positive times a negative is going to remain negative. So this is 2 sets of negative 5. So it's negative 5 plus negative 5, which is negative 10. So this guy right here is negative 10. We know, again, we know our final answer has to be 0 because we already solved this problem and we know it's 0. So we're just tackling it in a different way, but we better end up at the same final answer. So now I need to know, well, what number can I add negative 10 to give me 0? Well, the answer is going to be positive 10 because those are opposites. So in this case, this negative 5 times negative 2 had to be positive 10 so that our sum would be 0, just like we solved this problem initially above. So negative 5 times negative 2 must equal positive 10. And I'm not going to assess you on, whether you truly understand what's happening behind the scenes. Hopefully you were able to follow that. I think you do have the knowledge to be able to understand that and should have been able to follow it. But here's what I really need you to know. At the end of the day, a negative times a negative is always going to be a positive. So we can just go ahead and multiply normally, and we just need to recognize that a negative times a negative will always be a positive. So now if we look at negative 3 times negative 5, well, that's going to be positive 15. Negative 6 times negative 10, that's going to be positive 60. Negative 8 times negative 1.5. I can use my distributive property again, and I'll go ahead and do that because that'll be interesting. Times, so this is going to be negative 1 plus negative 0.5. And I'll distribute in. Negative 8 times negative 1 is 8, plus negative 8 times half. Well, half of 8 is 4. Negative times a negative is a positive, so this gives me 12. Let's take a look at a couple more examples together. Although, probably don't need my help here. Please remember that parentheses, if there's nothing in front of the parentheses, but there's a number out there, our ghost operation is always multiplication. And I usually tell students to dot it up. I like them to throw in a dot there so that they never forget that you are indeed multiplying. So I usually squeeze in a dot there. So this is negative 4 times 6. A negative times a positive is going to remain negative. That's negative 24. A negative times a negative is going to be positive. 2 times 8 is 16. So you just need to keep in mind your rules.